Let's zoom out of our context and really think of the bigger picture. I really want to know, like, which tribe in Nigeria has, any sort of veto power, is on the Security Council at the UN? Which tribe in Nigeria is calling the shots at the IMF or the World Bank? We're like crabs in a barrel. None of us actually have power on the world stage. Like, all of our conceptions of like how important these tribal identities are, like on the global level, mean absolutely nothing against the imperialist system that is dominating Africa. Like, there is not a single tribe on the continent of Africa that has any sort of real political standing. Just take a step back, zoom out of our really micro-nationalist context and really look at what it means on an international level to, be an African person.
All right. Oh, all right. Welcome to Pan-African Perspectives. This is a weekly live stream where we dive into the real life experiences, visiting Africa, moving to the continent of Africa, investing in African ventures, and potentially buying land, all with the ultimate purpose, and ultimate goal of advancing Africa and restoring its rightful place on the world stage. Our mission is to support an independent Africa and empower African people on the continent or in the diaspora. Whether you're currently living in Africa, you've recently migrated, your ancestors were trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade, or you're a foundational Black American, this live stream is for you. I'm Joe Hatagwa, your host and the founder of Authentic African. And each week I'll share my experiences living, traveling, and investing in Africa. From time to time, I'll also be interviewing others who have made the move to the continent, offering their insights and stories. So join us as we explore a journey towards a liberated and thriving Africa. So today we have a special guest, as you just saw in that video, Inem Richardson, who is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. She's from the Bay Area in Northern California. She now lives in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and is the founder of the Thomas Sankara Center, a Pan-African library, and a political education center. She records oral histories on the revolution led by Captain Thomas Sankara. She is also currently a journalist with African Stream, which is a Pan-African digital media organization focused on giving a voice to all Africans through cutting-edge African-centric content. And if you follow the channel, you will also know that she is also a co-host of a live stream that I host with her weekly called This Week in Africa, which is a collaboration between Authentic African, this platform here, and African Stream. We break down this week's breaking news and its impact on Pan-Africans and African independence. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Inem Richardson. Inem, what's up? How are you?
Greetings. I'm happy to be on. I can't believe that I'm on. I was telling you before we got started, like, I'm so used to doing live streams with you, but never like in this context. So I'm really excited. I think this is going to be very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. We get to hear a lot of your insight weekly, and we know that you bring a lot of facts and dates and numbers to those discussions, lots of context to the news that we're reporting on weekly. And now we get to hear a little bit about you. So it's different than the usual, right? It's usually me reading a story and asking you your thoughts. But today we get to find out more about you and answer some questions that I've had. Of course, as you all may have guessed, Inem obviously has made the move from the West to West Africa. And so we are going to talk about that, her journey there, how she got there, and why she made the move. But before we do, I do, well, first of all, there's a couple of folks that really appreciated that earlier step. So Seth says exactly what I was saying to myself today. Seth says none of any African countries has representative in the global stage. that are a great red flag. That should be a great red flag for us and what's happening, and it's been happening for centuries. So you have some agreement already. So before we kind of talk about where you are today, right? Because there's a lot that you're doing today. I always like to start from the beginning, right? You know, where did you come from? Who were you before you became the Inem Richardson that we know today? So can we just start from the literally the beginning? Where were you born and where were you raised?
Okay. So I'm from San Jose, California, in the Bay Area. So shout out Bay Area. And yeah, I grew up in San Jose pretty much up until I went to college, to university for some, because I'm in so many international contexts now. I don't know which one to say. But you know, where we're from, we say college. And so up until that point, I pretty much grew up in Northern California, in the Bay Area, my entire life. And then I moved out when I was 17, when I moved away from that area.
Okay, cool. And what did you study in school, like when you went to college or university?
Okay, so I went to Barnard College, which is in New York City, and I double majored in Africana Studies and Comparative Literature. So now I did use those skills, especially actually both of them. I basically studied like African literature in French and in Portuguese. So obviously living in Burkina, I use a lot of French. People don't know that I also speak Portuguese as well, though, which are skills that I picked up from my college experience.
That makes so much sense. I always wondered where the French came from, because you're so fluent in it. So that okay, it is. Okay.
I'll definitely get into more detail about exactly how that happened. But yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I so obviously, you're a pretty fluid French speaker, and where you are currently, one of the major languages spoken there, and what we, I guess, unaffectionately call Francophone West Africa. Many people do speak French there, and so and I think that's and a lot of your interviews, especially from the street, are in French. And I know that's a point of contention for some, and but it helps people to understand the conversations, where it just makes it so there's a common language that you can speak to all the folks that you're speaking to. But I do want to know, you're obviously involved in, the All African People's Congress, and you're also a Pan-Africanist. You're an activist. What got you into Pan-Africanism and activism in the first place?
Okay, so I think this is where things get kind of interesting and also probably kind of long, because there's a lot of I don't know, there's a lot of moments, a lot of things that kind of added up over time. So I come from a mixed race family. So my father is European American. My mom is a Nigerian, an immigrant from Nigeria. And I grew up in San Jose, as I mentioned. Largely, I would say within my mom's Nigerian community outside of school. So I was in a lot of Nigerian churches, various very many different churches, honestly, and different sort of Nigerian community immigrant events and stuff like that. But that was not the same as my school experience, where actually I was one of very few African kids, Black kids. In the APRP, we call all Black people Africans. So please know I'm using the term in the broadest sense. But I was one of very few in my school setting. And I got really bullied a lot in school, actually, even though you would think, I think a lot of people think of the Bay Area, Northern California, as a very progressive place and very racially diverse place. And to be honest, it is. I would say it's very diverse in terms of there's a lot of immigrants, but a lot of African people have been pushed out of San Jose over the past few decades. And so I was like really tormented in school, honestly. Like I got called like everything you could imagine. Like I was called the N-word. This is like mostly when I was in middle school. I was called cotton picker. People were making fun of like all my physical appearances. Kids would come up and like sniff me and tell me that I smell like a Black person, or like that they knew Black people had a scent. Like it was like I feel like it was a very traumatic formative experience, especially at that kind of age where you're like young and like insecure. I had like, there was another Black girl in my middle school who actually ended up transferring schools because she felt like the bullying got so bad. And I just remember like she would be like crying, and then eventually she left the school. But I don't know if I let that experience, I think in part radicalize me a little bit at a young age, because when I was around, like, so I'm in my mid-20s, so this also gives some like context to the timeline here. So
Sure.
when, for example, Trayvon Martin, so when George Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin, I'm hoping most of our viewers are familiar with this. I don't know like where people are coming from and their background watching this, but like, when George Zimmerman was acquitted for murdering Trayvon Martin, I was 13 years old. I was in 8th grade. And I actually remember very, very explicitly, like, being like a pivotal moment for my sort of conception of the United States. And I think it was also a big moment for me to feel like, I think I was going through like personal sort of traumatic experiences as a very young person in my like interpersonal day-to-day life. And then I think I was seeing something also like playing out on the television that kind of led to a little bit of a connection there. I was like, okay, there's something beyond like my personal experience with racism in terms of what I'm going through at school. Like there's a systemic problem, even though I didn't know that kind of word at that point in time. Like I was like, okay, there's a problem with the United States. And I remember that very clearly because I had so much faith. I was a child. I had so much faith in the United States at the time. And my mom didn't, she'd been in the United States for a few decades. So she was around in the US in the 90s. So she remembered, Rodney King. And so she had context that I didn't have. She'd been an immigrant in the United States for decades. And so she told me from the beginning, she's like, I know how this is going to play out. And I just didn't understand that because I was, I was young, and I feel like, in some ways, I guess I was sheltered, but also like not exactly. I think I had, I think I experienced a lot of racism, but maybe just like different, like obviously like a different way from how Trayvon Martin did, in the sense that, I didn't necessarily have like run-ins with police officers or anything like that. Well, then again, members of my family did. So I guess, but I think I just, at the time at 13, that's when certain dots started to connect for me. And that was the beginning, if you remember, like the Trayvon Martin case was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. So that's when, the term Black Lives Matter kind of became popular. People started talking about like Black Lives Matter, this and that. And so the next year I went off to high school, and I think I was seeing this movement beginning to emerge within the context of the US. And I was very, I was intrigued. I began to become, passionate about what was going on and what I was seeing. And I think I also had, certain like personal experiences that were weighing on me. I think, it took me a while to work out some of the like trauma from the racism I experienced, even to be able to talk about it, like was hard for me initially, because I was very like, I don't know. I was kind of just alone in that context. Like there was, like I mentioned, there's another Black girl who left because there was so much bullying, but I don't know. I just didn't really open up to like a lot of people about it, but I did kind of let that push me politically as a teenager, as a teenager. And so as a teen, I started to have like this interest in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I understood that there was a historical context to what was going around. I didn't have the same political clarity that I do now, obviously, but I began to have like interest in, I guess the way I'd phrase it now is like interest in the politics of Black liberation. And so I'm interested in the Black Lives Matter movement that's emerging, but I'm also at this time as, now maybe like 14, 15, 16, interested in like reading like Malcolm X. This is the time when I was reading like Malcolm X. I was reading Angela Davis. I was reading Assata Shakur. And so it's just trying to figure out kind of like what was going on with this country, like with that country. Like how did it become a place that was so hostile towards Africans or towards Black people? And, what pretty much like how was that something that people previously were addressing and were, what did the struggle look like in the historical context? I was part of the Black Student Union in my high school. I actually served briefly, or maybe like a year and a half, I don't remember, as like president of the Black Student Union while I was in high school. Again, it was small. I think like San Jose, like I said, like the Black communities have been getting pushed out for a while. So it was a rather small Black Student Union, but we existed and we tried really hard to struggle against, racism that continued into high school, which wasn't as bad as my middle school experience. But of course, I mean, I think this is just part of being African in America. Like everybody has stories from their school experience, regardless, honestly, of where you study and who's around you and what that looks like. Some way or another, there's fundamentally, whether it's like interpersonally or systemic, deeply rooted racist problems. But, I began to have those kinds of interests. I even like politically, I started saying things when I was in high school. Like I said that I'm a socialist to people because I was reading Angela Davis and Assata, and I realized that was what they believed in. I don't think that I fully understood that politic. Like, I don't know if I actually defined it, but I knew that like Angela Davis and Assata Shakur and even Malcolm X were all telling me that capitalism was very messed up and that capitalism was part of the problem. And so I took that up when I was like maybe like 15, 16, and I was like, okay, this is what I've learned from them. And so I know that capitalism is part of why, we're oppressed as a people. And I began to kind of have those inklings. Sorry, I told you this response would be long. This is, I think, the longest response.
It's helpful though.
But there's a lot. So let me speed it up a little bit. Sorry. So fast forward. Okay, so that was my high school experience. I went off to college, as I mentioned. I went to Barnard in New York. But my friends, because I grew up in the Bay, I had a lot of friends who ended up going to LA to study, like LA area. It's a very common, obviously, like, LA and the Bay have certain exchanges. And one of my best friends, probably my best friend actually from high school, she's of a Chicana background, so like Mexican origin. But she was interested in a lot of, the political stuff that I was interested in. She was trying to figure stuff out herself. And the school that she went to actually was organizing a summer trip. And she sent me the flyer and she's like, Inem, like, I feel like you'd be interested in this. And it was a delegation to go to Honduras to meet with the Garifuna community that lives along the coastline of Honduras. And if you're not familiar, the Garifuna people are an African descended people who live across Central America. They are a maroon community. So their ancestors fled slavery and created liberated settlements in Central America. And the context of the delegation was to learn about their political struggle, kind of also in light of the Black Lives Matter struggle that was existing within the United States. And basically to build like bridges between, what's happening there and what's happening here. And that trip was organized by a group called the Chiapas Support Committee, which became the first political organization that I'd ever become a part of or that I ever joined. And when I tell you that I think of everything, that was something that set me on the clearest trajectory. Like it was a major point of no return for me, because when I got to Honduras, I was meeting with African people. And they were talking about their experience. And, I'm in the United States, we're struggling against things like mass incarceration, against things like police violence, shootings, this and that. And I'm sitting with African people who are speaking Spanish. We have an interpreter. They're in a different country.
in Central America. And they're also talking to me about police violence and, mass incarceration. They're telling me that their leaders are being assassinated, that they're being, members of their community are being kidnapped. And then what blows my mind is that their grievances are with the same government that our grievances are with, because they're pointing the heart of their issue to U.S. imperialism, which at the time that I was in Honduras, the United States had very recently backed a coup to overthrow the democratically elected president and replace that person with like a super neo-colonial, pro-US lackey. I mean, to such a blatant extent that like right after the US puppet was installed, there was a meeting in the capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa, that was called Honduras is Open for Business. And all these US and Canadian businessmen flocked into the country. And then I'm talking to these African people who are talking about how ever since that happened to them, they've just been more brutalized than ever. They want to get the Garifuna people off of their lands. They want to get their lands, they want to sell their lands to tourists, build hotels. They don't want these people around. There's been this corporate takeover. The US is behind this. The US is backing this. So I'm in like a totally different country communicating and, between a totally different, with the language barrier and everything. We have almost an identical struggle and the same enemies, like the same grievances. It's the same issue. It's with the United States government. And that opened my eyes to a reality that just has shaken me ever since. And I realized that, from that point, I was like, okay, the United States government is not just having issues with racism within its borders. The United States government is interfering and wreaking havoc and actually devastating people all around the world. Like there is no safety or something outside of the US, like the United States basically has this sort of global dominion where it's, basically creating police states wherever it goes. And so that really blew my mind. And the Chiapas Support Committee recruited me into the organization. Okay, I know I'm talking a lot, but
well, it's helpful context. I think so, because that's your first start, right? So I think it was good because you wove the story from where it started, where it was personal. Then through your education, you found the historical context of some of the things you had been experiencing personally. And then you left the country and found that you saw the same thing happening to folks outside the United States. So I think there's kind of a through line through that, right? Because that leads you to kind of the next phases of your life, right? And so I'm interested to hear from you how you get from that trip to Honduras, right, while you're university or college age. And by the way, it's really interesting to hear your early life because I had a lot of the same experiences. It made me feel like an old man. I'm much older than you. So realizing the differences in age of like maybe about 15 years, I had some very similar experiences in Pennsylvania. It's interesting to see how those experiences shaped you and you further educated yourself differently. It took me a while to get to the point where I am today. So it's interesting to see that it kind of almost was an immediate transition for you. So I'm just listening, and I think it's really interesting. But from this Honduras trip, how do you get to the All African People's Revolutionary Party? How did you get to be involved in that party? And let's talk about what it is too. What is the All African People's Revolutionary?
Okay, so I'll try to make this also brief because I feel like I have so much to say to a lot of these questions. But okay, just to summarize quickly certain things. So from that Honduras trip on, I joined the Chiapas Support Committee, which basically provided students, like it was geared towards university students, and they basically were able to use like a lot of university funds, like find ways to kind of finesse certain things to bring students on anti-imperialist delegations across the Americas. So I was at the time organizing for African and Indigenous liberation across the Americas. That was like largely the framework, though they did have an interest in the global South more broadly. But I went to Cuba with them, which also like I could talk about for a long time, but I guess, I keep it pushing because there's so much I could say. Sure. But, that really politicized me further and really helped me develop because Cuba is a very different context from like Honduras. It's a liberated zone within the Americas. But I was interested in Africa, like deeply interested in Africa because of my own, family background. And I wanted to understand, okay, if these kinds of things are happening in Latin America, and I'm seeing, I'm learning about the history of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States intervening across the Americas. I just, I didn't have that much historical context at the time, a little bit, but I was like, I just know that if this kind of thing is happening seemingly all across the Americas, something has got to be going on across the African continent. And I was really, really pushing and itching to figure out what is the African piece to this. How does this imperialist, this imperialism thing that I'm learning about in the Latin American context then apply to the continent where my mother was born and raised? And so I studied abroad when I was in college. I did 2 semesters abroad. My first semester was in Senegal. So that's how I really, really learned French. Like I told you, I'd get to this eventually. I took classes and this and that. I started taking classes in high school, but it was really when I was in Senegal that I was forced to learn French. And I really started to learn French well. And in, again, a very actually anti-imperialist context, I got to Senegal and I was hungry to figure out what is imperialism within an African context and how are people fighting against it. I didn't really know much about Pan-Africanism. I think I'd heard of Pan-Africanism and thought it was an old person's thing. I don't think I knew young people interested in Pan-Africanism until I got to Africa. And then I was like, oh, no, it's real. The youth are taking this up. So in Senegal, I encountered an organization called the Front for an Anti-Imperialist, Popular, and Pan-African Revolution. That group was the first group that taught me about what France specifically was doing in Africa. This CFA franc currency that France is using to manipulate African countries or to dominate and control them. This history of French covert operations, assassinations, regime change, the French military occupation of the Sahel region, all of that I learned very quickly within a span of a few months. And again, my mind is just being blown at this point. I was 19, 20. And the next semester I go to Ghana, and that's where I first encountered the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the AAPRP. So while I'm studying abroad in Ghana, I'm trying to figure out as much as I can about what's going on with imperialism. And now I have this interest in Pan-Africanism that was sparked in Senegal. What is it? It's a term I'm hearing a lot. People seem to want to unify Africa, but I don't really understand it that deeply. I understand the imperialist aspect, but the AAPRP was what gave me the solution. That, it's not just about what we're fighting against. We're fighting against imperialism. It's true, but there's a solution. There's something that we can do that could put an end to this, that could change this. So the All African People's Revolutionary Party is an organization that was founded by the Osajifo, so Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, one of the great Pan-African leaders. So he founded the All African People's Revolutionary Party. He mentions it in one of his books, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. I highly recommend people read that. And he co-founded it. So he was the one who he came up with the term AAPRP, called for it to be created. And then he launched it into existence with Ahmed Sékou Touré and Amilcar Cabral, as well as Kwame Touré. And a lesser known figure, he's not really, unfortunately, he's not as well known historically, whose name is Lamine Janga. All together, they formed the first work study circle of the AAPRP. And that's how the organization operates. The basic unit is within the form of work study circles. It's an organization that takes political education very seriously. So I feel sometimes people see me on some of the streams we do and they're like, oh, that's so interesting what you have to say. Or sometimes people might think I have good ideas. I'm always super honest. These are not my ideas. I did not come up with these things. I read a lot. I'm part of the AAPRP. We all read a lot. We read a lot. Nothing I say is original, and I'm willing to admit it. I read Nkrumah, I read Ahmed Sékou Touré, I read Cabral, I read Sankara, and all of those people had the ideas. I just regurgitate it. I'm just be real with people, and I want people to do the same. I want them to pick up a book. I want them to read. I always push political education very hard, but that's what the AAPRP is. And like I mentioned, the AAPRP brought me that solution. The AAPRP defines Pan-Africanism not as an ideology or as a movement, but as an objective, something that we have to achieve and we have to fight for. And the AAPRP defines Pan-Africanism as the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, which is a definition that emerged during the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945. which Kwame Nkrumah was a major part of. And so it understands that capitalism was a system that underdeveloped Africa. Walter Rodney talks about this in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, another great one that I recommend. But if you look at how capitalism developed historically, Africans were that first commodity under the world capitalist economy that gave Europe its boost in order to jumpstart capitalist industrial development. And since that time, the basis of the capitalist global economy has been that Africa is integrated within that economy as a producer of raw materials and the importer of manufactured goods. But the APRP, and through studying Nkrumah, through studying Sekou Touré, through studying Cabral and many others, these are all like revolutionary Pan-Africanist and socialist leaders. They understood that socialism is actually about an industrialization process that uplifts the masses of African people collectively. And again, also just to add, the other aspect of this is that Africa must be unified. It's not about doing this, in any one country, but we have to understand in the long run, it has to be done on a continental scale. So just really quickly, last thing, because I know I'm speaking a lot on every question, the way I explain this to people here in Burkina Faso is I say, we want to do what Thomas Sankara did, but we want to do it on a continental level, on an African scale, because we saw that unfortunately Thomas Sankara was taken out after only 4 years. But if Africa is unified, that's impenetrable. They can't come and take that out. And then just one last thing, I know I said that a second ago. I think it's also important that I point out, so Kwame Touré, who was a major member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, said something all the time, and that changed my conception and made Pan-Africanism the focus and the priority of my life. He was very clear that until Africa is free, no African anywhere will ever be free or respected. And that is so important because when we look at the racism in the United States, in Honduras, in Brazil, across the Americas, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in France, in the Netherlands, everywhere we go, we see African people are treated very badly. Well, that's because Africa, our homeland, is not liberated, is not free. And so we can't really expect as a people that we're going to have like a dignified international position until our home base is liberated. And even if people don't like us outside of Africa, if Africa's free, there's very little that they can do to us. Like the West doesn't like China at all. The United States hates China, but the United States cannot go around like massacring Chinese people because China is too much of a threat to the United States to allow for the US police forces to go just shoot up Chinese people. So we really have to understand, like, until Africa is free, none of us are getting anywhere. So you can be in Oakland, you can be in, Mississippi, you can be in Barbados, you can be in, where can you be? Port-au-Prince or Bahia, Brazil, or, Paris or Marseille or wherever, Brixton, UK, anywhere. We're not getting anywhere until this continent is liberated. That's priority number one before anything else. Okay, I'll stop there because I'll get worked up.
Yeah, well put. I mean, and look, we can see where the passion comes from. When we have our conversations on This Week in Africa, right? And we start talking about some of the things like, the video that we showed earlier, right? Like it hits you, I was like, boom, right away, right? It was like the passion was flowing through you. And it's clear that it's all of these experiences led to this point and how you feel, why you feel the way you do. Shout out to Tony McKinney, who said they agree. So this is really interesting because it really helps me understand how you got to this point. And it's, obviously you're a voracious reader, and all of this is kind of, it pours through you, right? When we have our conversations about what's going on the continent, because unfortunately, much of what all the folks that you've talked about have been fighting for are still struggles, especially on the continent. I think in the United States, there are many folks that will say these things are no longer issues. Nobody is disputing that these are still issues on the continent of Africa, right? I think that these are, and so I mean, I would disagree that people would say these aren't issues in the United States, but you can see it. It's blatant. It's in front of you every day when you're in most countries that I visited on the continent of Africa. And so you've had all these experiences, you've gotten this education, you've gone to West Africa, right? You had gone to Senegal, you went to Ghana. That was, maybe about less than 6-7 years ago. When did you then move to Burkina Faso, and why Burkina Faso of all countries on the continent of Africa?
Okay. So I mean, why is easy, because I was inspired by the Thomas Sankara legacy. Burkina Faso has a very revolutionary reputation, and even after the Thomas Sankara period, I was intrigued because the country had an insurrection in 2014 and overthrew Blaise Compaoré in this popular uprising. So I was like, okay, people seem to still be politicized. There seems to be, even after the Sankara era, some sort of political consciousness, and I wanted to check it out. But I didn't actually know I was going to move to Burkina necessarily. So I originally came to Burkina Faso. So I met the first people I ever met who were from Burkina Faso while I was studying abroad in Senegal. And so I connected very much with the Burkinabe community, because there's I'm a little bit of a Burkinabe diaspora who is in Senegal. And I was, I stayed in contact with them. And when I was in college, I decided to apply for a temporary I guess a little grant that's designed for undergraduate students to do a project over the summer for 3 months. So they give you like $10,000 to do like a little summer project. And I was like, oh, wait, I want to do something in Burkina Faso. And so I talked to these contacts that I had known in Senegal. Some of them had moved back to Burkina out and were back. They were there largely for school, and they'd come back. And I talked to them about doing like a little project. And I didn't really think, okay, I'm going to move to Burkina Faso. I think it was more like, let me just do like a little project for a few months. And I was motivated by my, what I was like, my political education that I was receiving through the APRP. And so it became a question of like, how can we transfer resources to Burkina, given, I mean, I went to college in the United States. I went to, I feel like this is typical in a lot of colleges in the US. You have like a university library, and it tends to be like very robust. Like, I feel like most students can get their hands on like a lot of books if you go to higher education, go through higher education in the United States. So I had just like a lot of books at my fingertip, even like, books that weren't on my campus. Universities have exchange systems. You can get almost anything. And then it's like I come to the continent, and it's like you can't even find Thomas Sankara's speeches in his home country. And I go, to be fair, so at the time I actually did see sometimes, occasionally, like a Thomas Sankara speaks, but like occasionally, and way overpriced like beyond what anybody could afford. You come out, like here in Burkina, for example, there's like, you can't get any book by Kwame Nkrumah. I've never, ever seen one outside of the Thomas Sankara Center. You can't get, Frantz Fanon or, Amilcar Cabral, Ahmed Sékou Touré. They don't sell any of these. Impossible. Like, you never find it. And this was a reality I was seeing across West Africa, because, I'd been to Senegal, Ghana, I'd been to Nigeria. And I was kind of seeing a general pattern, which is that Pan-African books are really hard to come across. You don't get them easily here. And when you occasionally do, they're super, super, super overpriced, like beyond what people can afford. And so it was an idea of just like, okay, can we do like a little project for a few months of like bringing in some resources? But I don't know. I feel like, I had really good comrades on the ground here. And let me give a quick shout out to them also, because, I recognize I get to speak sometimes on these platforms because I speak English, and I grew up in the US. And so, I have a lot more opportunities. So let me give a quick shout out. The co-founder of the center is Wenlasida Simpore. So we actually founded it together. Wenlasida Simpore, who grew up here in Ouagadougou. One of our first members ever is Osian Passamde Sawadogo. So like he has been part of the Thomas Sankara Center from the very beginning. We have other like very dedicated comrades, Francois Sam, Donald Dabire. These are the names of people who run the library like regularly. We have Fatou Balora. Just giving quick shout outs because I feel like it's better to say their names than to leave them out of this, but because it's so important, the work that they do. Kusube and Diabuga. These are people who really contributed to this project. And so it was about transferring resources. It was about, how can the diaspora contribute to the liberation of the continent through, sending back certain things that we have access to. And that started like right after timeline wise, basically I was supposed to go right after my senior year of college. But then COVID hit and I was stranded for about a year. And so I didn't end up coming out here until 2021. And so that's when some of the foundation became laid for the project. And then it launched in October. So this October will be our 3rd anniversary.
Wow. Okay. So it started out as a project, just working on this idea of what later became the Thomas Sankara Center. And but then you ended up deciding to move. So what made you, I know you wanted to do this project, but what made you decide that you wanted to move to Burkina Faso instead of doing this remotely from anywhere in the States, let's say New York and or San Jose or Los Angeles, where you had mentioned, your education and people you had known had been living?
Well, I feel like the nature of the project, like it's about books, but it's also deeply about political education. And so we have an APRP work study circle at the Thomas Sankara Center where we study collectively. We have like a Young Pioneers program where young, children ages 8 to 14 learn about imperialism and neocolonialism and Pan-Africanism and, Kwame Nkrumah and Cabral and all these people that I've mentioned. And so I feel like setting that up probably wouldn't have worked remotely. Maybe at a certain point I could have left, but I feel like it's hard. There's just so much, to be honest. I think I just really began to see like the project was super important. And it seemed like, the people around me, the comrades that I have here believe deeply in the project. And so we just became so invested in it. And I think even to now, it's like we're pushing the project to grow and expand like so much. I just feel like we're constantly it's pretty much like an everyday thing. We're doing like something, to work to grow the Thomas Sankara Center, to spread political education, to reach more people, to get out there, reach people in different parts of the country, even now different parts of the Sahel, which is exciting. And I'm sure I'll get to that. But I don't know, there's just such a need. And the consciousness in Burkina is just like incredible. I think, to be honest, I like going back to my biggest reason to go back to the United States, sometimes is like to see my family that lives there and, to see my friends. And that's very hard for me to be far from them. Like honestly, it's like a very, very hard to be so far from my family is like the hardest thing. But beyond that, going back to the US is like kind of shocking for me. Because I think that Burkina Faso in some ways is just so advanced. Like I've never been to a country where people love their country to this extent and love Africa. And like for such genuine and like pure reasons. Like, the United States has like racist, patriotic, I don't know, like redneck people, but that's not what I mean. Like, I mean like people who actually have like an indigenous claim to the land that they're on and just like love their country and believe so deeply in the liberation of their people. And like, Burkina Faso blows my mind because it's just like, I'm in a place where people are so conscious of the fact that they have been exploited for so long. Like they just know that they've been wronged historically and up into the present, and that it's not okay, and that they have an obligation as a people to fight back against that. And so like nowadays in Burkina, like, I talk about the AES all the time. I guess I can't get started on that because I won't stop, but I'll just say like one really quickly, I'm literally in a context right now where I spend time with like 15, 16, 17-year-olds who will look me in the eye and say, and with all seriousness, like total conviction, just honestly and purely say, like, I will die for Burkina Faso and I would die for Africa. And I would be proud to be a martyr that would liberate my people. Like it's incredible that like teenagers would have this kind of consciousness, but the collectivism is so strong. And then just the last thing, I keep doing this thing where I say one last thing twice. But let me get away with it real quick. Like this is a country where like if you're really down bad, like on your luck or something, like say you have like $1 to your name, like people will genuinely go and give that $1 to one of their neighbors in need because they're like, oh, the community's got me. Like people genuinely will give like their last like sifa, like their last dollar to somebody whoever, like somebody who asks for it, because they're like, oh, like my neighbor's got my back. Like I've never been to a place where that was like literally the reality, but that's how it is here. So it just really just like there's so many things that I like, it baffles me, and it's become like a way of life.
I mean, this is really interesting, and I mean, look, you and I have talked about how conscious people are there on the ground and how aware they are of their history and what's happening currently. And you mentioned how much they're willing to fight for their people, but it's borderless, right? It's not Burkina Faso, but it's African people, right? From our conversations, we've talked about how they really welcomed in, you know, the folks from Mali, and they all are aware of what's happening, not just in Burkina Faso with, you know, these artificially drawn lines, but also what's happening across the Sahel and everywhere else across, you know, West and Africa in general. There's a question that came from the audience, which I think is interesting, considering you're there on the ground now, and you know, you've reported on this, and we'll be talking about this tomorrow, so maybe we can give a little bit. But Davy Floater is asking, was the attack on central Burkina covered, and are there any local media sources you can recommend?
Okay, I don't know if he means like covered like here, like on our stream, or like in
he means
the
covered
media.
here.
Okay, no, we haven't really talked about like a lot of current events in Burkina so far, but
Yeah.
I can definitely recommend like some sources. Well, I'll be honest, like there's very little in English that I think is really trustworthy and reliable. I'm a journalist with African Stream, so I do my best wherever I can to, you know, give really honest reporting about what is happening in Burkina Faso from the people's perspective, you know, from the perspective of like the majority of people who live here, which is unfortunately not what you're going to get in most of the English media covering Burkina Faso.
Right.
There is another news source called Afrique Media, which is based out of Cameroon. And it's like mostly in French, but they actually do translate a lot of their own articles into English. I think they have somebody on their team. Well, it's Cameroon, so I'm sure they have like English speakers involved. So they have like some English language recovering. If you type like Afrique Media, it's like a more, I'm referring more to like written articles. Like that would be like where it would go to for an English speaker in terms of like certain written updates about Burkina / the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES as a whole. I feel like unfortunately in English, those are like the only two sources that I could say like give regular coverage in English from an anti-imperialist angle regarding the AES that I know of.
Yeah, and as much as possible, we do try to cover these kinds of topics on the This Week in Africa, right? Where we together talk about what's happening throughout the continent of Africa. And this specific topic that you're asking about will be covered tomorrow, quick plug, for This Week in Africa, where Inem and I are going to go through not just this specific topic, but just how the West has really been working to try to destabilize what's happening in the Sahel region. So definitely I would recommend you look at the two sources that Inem just mentioned. And then of course, you want to check out this platform tomorrow and or African Stream tomorrow, because we do stream live simultaneously. And we will be talking about this specific story. So today is really an interview with Inem and her experience and why she moved to Burkina Faso and what her experience has been. And tomorrow is the week's news on the continent of Africa, and we will be covering this story. So I thought I would share that because, of course, it's a great plug for tomorrow's discussion. So, you know, we've gone through a wide range of topics, right? That kind of gets us to where you are today. And, you know, I just alluded to it, you know, briefly here, but I'd love to talk about your involvement with African stream, to kind of maybe close this out, and get an understanding of one of the other things that you're doing beyond the activism work, and the Thomas Sankara Center, but what you're doing as a journalist with African Stream. So one, I'd love to, and I mentioned what African Stream is earlier in this discussion, right? So I don't know if you want to tell what African Stream is in your own words, and then how you became connected with African Stream, and then I will take myself off stage. I'll be right back, but you can go ahead and tell that.
Okay, so African Stream is a Pan-African digital media platform, and I think it fits in very nicely with a lot of the other, like the organizing work I do, because it really gives a platform for, again, like the people's perspectives out here in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel. And so, I mean, I cover all sorts of things related to Pan-Africanism, related to the Alliance of Sahel States, struggles against imperialism. These are all very typical, like African Stream, typical stories. I was recruited into African Stream by a comrade, William Sakawa. Shout out, William Sakawa, who was interested in some of the stuff I was doing with the Thomas Sankara Center. And so he set up a call. I had no idea. I didn't really know about African Stream actually at all before I talked to him. This was the African Stream. I feel like it's hard to be a Pan-Africanist now. Well, not to like brag on the platform too much, but I feel like nowadays it's a much more well-known platform. It's grown so much, but at the time I didn't really know about it. I think it was more relatively new. And so Sakawa recruited me, and basically, through him, I was able to get work with African Stream, and it's just worked very, very nicely in terms of allowing for perspectives from the Sahel and from various parts of Africa who are strong, like anti-imperialist voices, to access, a wider audience, and that really push back against, I mean, the mainstream corporate media coverage of the Sahel is just awful. Sorry, is it my mic or is that your sound? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry, my bad. So yeah, I mean, like if you look at, like, unfortunately, like Al Jazeera, BBC, France 24, obviously, like all of these medias basically accuse the Sahel states of being, like, I don't know, like sadistic dictatorships that are destroying the lives of people. Like, it's just nothing to do at all with how, like, the vast majority, like, of people in this part of the world view these governments and these leaderships. But they'll talk about human rights abuses, this and that, and it's like, where? If you live here, it's like, where? What are you talking about? Where?
Yeah, and I mean, I think your viewpoints align perfectly with the platform, right? When I met Ahmed, the CEO, and we talked a bit, and I asked him if there was any way that we could collaborate, and he mentioned to me he thought Inem would be the perfect person because her views align with the views of the platform, and she could speak for the platform and on behalf of the platform weekly when we're talking about news stories, as the fact that you are reporting on many of the things happening on the continent, specifically in the Sahel region, but even outside of the Sahel region. And so, I think it's really important to kind of hear the story behind the person. I learned a lot about your background today. I was not aware of many of these things that we talked about today. Obviously, I knew you were passionate about what you believed, and you were also very knowledgeable. That was apparent to me from the first time we had our live stream. I don't really have to say much, and I also learn a lot through the process as well, because I am a lifelong learner, and I'm not as a voracious a reader as you are. So I'm learning as we go along. But I think this is really important stuff, and I think Golden Roots believes the same. Golden Roots is saying the same here in the comments. Very important and interesting information. Yeah, agreed. And I wanted to tell your story, but also have you speak to your experience, because your experience, I think, is a learning experience, I think, for everyone. And I started calling this live stream maybe 5 months ago, Pan-African Perspectives, because I have been evolving in my own political beliefs and my own thoughts about the world, and become a little bit more, I don't want to say radicalized, but I've absolutely become a little bit more invested in seeing a united African front and seeing that become, you know, a force to be reckoned with. But I will say this, you know, it's been a pleasure to have you on the This Week in Africa. It's been a really educational and enlightening experience over the last few months, and I'm excited to continue to have these conversations, because I think it's really important for those who watch these live streams and even for my own personal education. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to have these kinds of discussions. You know, I think it's necessary, and it's the first step to making real change and making progress, right? Is just informing yourself to begin with, as you did so many years ago. You know, talking about reading Angela Davis and, you know, Kwame Nkrumah and all the folks that you had been reading at such an early age. Before we go, because we are at time, and we can have this conversation all day. I have many more questions to ask you, but maybe we'll do a part 2, and I'll be asking you these personally anyway. But before we go, I do have a couple of questions for you, just in terms of where people can find information on, one, yourself and let's say the Thomas Sankara Center, and then 2, the AAPRP.
Okay, cool. So for the Thomas Sankara Center, people can find us on Instagram at Burkina Books. I think, you know, I might have sent you some links. So I mentioned that the Thomas Sankara Center is currently in a process of expanding quite a bit right now. We're actually opening another Thomas Sankara Center in Niger, which is very, very exciting. So the Thomas Sankara Center currently, you know, post that one grant I received back when I was in college, since that time has been 100% grassroots funded. You know, we are funded just through donations, through support of like regular people who believe in African liberation and who want to support liberation struggles on the continent. And so what we're doing right now is we have a book drive for Niger. So I've mentioned books a lot on this live stream, and how important it is to read, and how unavailable books are in a lot of parts of Africa. And so we collect books for Burkina Faso and Niger. And, you know, so we're currently doing a book drive where people can either send money or they can order books directly through our Amazon wish list. And we'll get those over to currently to Niger, and in the future we'll do some more for Burkina. And so if you have ever read, you know, any book that has touched you or inspired you in any way, then, you know, why not, you know, send that to a library so people could freely access that book, you know, living in Burkina Faso or in Niger, so they can also have access to these works. And so if you're interested in that, I think we have some links in the YouTube. I think there's some links in the YouTube comment section, or what do you call it? The bio. Is that the word? The description. Yeah, the description. Yeah, thank you. In the description, about like ways that you could support that and get involved in that. Because like I said, it really is just like regular good-willed people who pretty much provide 100% of what the Thomas Sankara Center needs and uses materially and makes publicly available, free of charge, for the people who live here in Ouagadougou, and then now soon for the people who live in the capital city, Niamey, in Niger. So we have those links below. And then we have a Facebook page, though I'd say our Facebook page is a little bit more in French, because it's more geared towards, you know, getting people who are in this area to come and check out our political education work, and to come and check out books and to access these resources. And then what else? All African People's Revolutionary Party. So the AAPRP International is the website. So you can, I should send you that link. Maybe you can add that to the description. I should have sent it to you before, actually. I didn't think of, but yeah, AAPRP International. And then that's also the Instagram handle. So AAPRP International on Instagram. And then I believe on X, it's just AAPRP, I think. Should just be AAPRP on X. What else do we have? We have a Facebook page, All African People's Revolutionary Party. There's like a little dash between the all and the African. So All African People's Revolutionary Party. That's an organization you can join from anywhere in the world. There are people in Ghana, as I mentioned, in the United States, in France, in South Africa. We call it Azania within the organization. Kenya, anywhere you are, basically. Germany. Even if you are living somewhere like maybe you are in Japan and we don't have an AAPRP section there, you can still join, and we'll make sure that you are able to at least virtually join and participate in a work study circle, and be prepared, because if you engage in a political education process for a long enough time, it will change your life. So be prepared for that, which is very good. And just last final words, then I would encourage everybody listening to join an organization, whether it's the AAPRP or not. Maybe there's another organization out there for you, but we're not going to win our liberation or achieve our liberation if we're not organized as a people. So join something that is fighting for Africa's liberation wherever you are. We all have that responsibility. And also political education, like read. It's so good. It's so important to read. Okay, somebody said please elaborate about AAPRP. So that's the All African People's Revolutionary Party. It's the organization that I talked about a little bit earlier. So if you missed that part, you can kind of like rewind. I talk a little bit about my experience with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, but the acronym that we use is AAPRP. So definitely check it out. You can search it online. The website gives a lot of helpful information as well.
Absolutely. And I will just say again, thank you, Inem, for doing this. This has been a really enlightening discussion, and I'm glad the people who are watching got something out of it. And also thank you for joining me weekly on the live streams with in Africa, which we are going live tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So for those of you who want to know more about what's happening on the continent of Africa from the lens of a Pan-African perspective, with those who are informed, people on the ground, and the Western media outlets, the stuff that you won't hear from them, we definitely would recommend you tune in weekly. We cover the stories that those who don't want to see Africa succeed won't cover, and who also sometimes silence and suppress those voices on the social media platforms. So if this was interesting to you, we'd love for you to like, comment, subscribe, hit that thumbs up, hit that notification bell so you're notified every time a new video comes out. Share this with anybody you know who needs this kind of information and wants to know more about how they can get politically involved, because this is really kind of the story of how someone can have their own personal experiences to becoming someone who puts together a center like the Thomas Sankara Center and moves to the continent of Africa. So one of the countries that you don't hear often people moving to, and why. So any final words, Inem, before we go?
Join an organization, as I said, very important. If you're able to donate a book for Niger, check out that Amazon wish list or contribute, because, even for there's books that are I think the cheapest one is €350. And even that would make a big difference in somebody's life. So if you're able to contribute that way, just know that it would go very far, and that'd be something that the whole community here would be able to use. And check out our stream tomorrow and watch some of our other live streams, because they're really cool, I think, and we have lots to say. And I think we even answer some questions that I raised here, maybe in some of our other live streams as well. So check those out.
Absolutely. And again, thanks for watching, guys. We will see you all on the next video.